where we slept in one of the rooms and worked up in the hollers, about 3 miles from the closest paved road, and really getting a sense of what was happening in some places in the U.S. I also was very privileged and lucky although my parents were not totally thrilled, I did study in India for a year, and that introduced me to many, it was an eye-opening. It was my first experience of really beyond Canada going any place outside of the US. And it introduced me to an appreciation of other cultures and religions, and also a sense of what was happening to women. Because indeed, I lived in the only women's hostel. Most of the girls lived at home or in relatives' homes. We had a wall around the whole building and were locked in at 8 o'clock. It was riding a bus. There were only a couple seats in the back of the bus where women could sit. So it was a whole different experience of what women could do, but it also gave me a wonderful opportunity to travel both in India and then on my way home, taking my time through Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, all these amazing places where, of course, in more recent times, it was very difficult for most of us to go. But that did lead to me doing graduate work after college at the University of Pennsylvania in political science and South Asian studies. And I was married and had 2 children and did the whole thing of juggling schedules and other things. But I will say that probably my first experiences of really feeling like there was discrimination against me as a woman came in early years of marriage, early 70s, when, for instance, my husband had also done a couple of years of graduate school, and he was applying to go to divinity school at the time. And when he began to get acceptances, he got one, but you had to live, a married couple had to live in a dorm with a shared kitchen and bathroom, and that didn't sound so appealing. But the one that struck me the most, he got in, as it happened, to Yale Divinity School, who wrote in the letter that I remember well, it said to him that he was accepted, however, with financial aid. The letter said, since you will be married, we were going to be married before that summer, since you will be married, we assume your wife can work. No question at all about what I might be doing. What did I want to work? Was I going to be going to school? It was just, we assume your wife can work. And thus this would be the financial arrangements that could be made for him. So that was one. I also began, I did get a job. We moved to Boston. And at that time, one had to qualify getting a credit card was a big deal. Most people didn't get credit cards. And I did qualify, if you will, which was not that big a salary at the time, but to get an American Express card. But when I did get that, I began to get letters from American Express saying, would I like a credit card for my wife? Or a pink card for my wife, as it was. So, there were things, I see smiles on people's faces. I don't know if some of you remember some of these things, but that was what, I began to just feel like, we went to establish open banks, and they would call me Joan, and my husband, who was same age, Mr. Winship, and just addressing the two of us differently in a different approach. So it was that work experience, which I think for many young women still today is sometimes the first time that we begin to feel some sense of a discrimination that maybe we didn't experience in school before. But over time, I worked in a number of decades in higher education, both in college teaching and in administration. And I also did some contract work with the State Department on special programs that brought international people to the US to learn more about the US politics, as well as culture. That was eye-opening in itself because I got to travel around the US um, and experience life in many different ways and different attitudes around the US. I will say throughout my teaching experience, I did teach various political science classes, but I had the opportunity to start in a number of places, a women in politics course that had never been in a curriculum before. So that was good. Or I was also able to co-teach in a multidiscipline women's studies program where I might teach a course with a woman who taught English literature, and I was teaching it from a political science, and we shared those experiences. So that really helped bring me into more and more both experiencing personally as well as through academics and professionally the experience that women were having during these times. I think one of the key things that's important is that I was lucky to work early in my career with a couple of women and deans at schools who had different, very, very different styles, but were also key in observing both in their own personal lives as well as in the lives of the young women at college and in society of what was changing for women at the time. And so this was, this was critical. I was learning and experiencing at the same time. Now, I will say, and I want to obviously, I was certainly not the only one kind of experiencing these. There were women certainly ahead of me, and I worked, as Chris mentioned, for 15 years or so as the executive director of the International Association of Women Judges. Among our obvious in the US, the best known members, of course, were the first two women on the Supreme Court, Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Now, they were well ahead of me in timing and age, but I might remind you all that Sandra Day O'Connor, who graduated top of her class, just about, she was number 3 at Stanford Law School, one of the top law schools in the country. When she graduated, at first she was only offered a position as a legal secretary. She was not offered a position at all as a working lawyer. And in fact, she offered to work for no pay with no office, actually, in order to start as a deputy county attorney. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who met her husband when they were at Cornell, they graduated, they married, and she had a child and then went 2 years to Harvard Law School. And then she transferred to Columbia to be with her husband, who himself, a lawyer, was getting a job in New York. She still graduated first in her class, and she was the first person ever to be on the law reviews of both Harvard and Columbia. But she had trouble getting a job too. This was in the 50s. But we know what they became later on in terms of reputation, but each had to work through in many different ways. Ruth Bader Ginsburg really became known as a lawyer who worked on issues of equal pay, equal work, gender, and human rights. And that's where she, many of the cases that she pleaded were on those issues. I will say that one interesting thing, I had a sophomore year roommate in college who got married after our sophomore year. She was able to, she continued and finished on time with her class, which she was very proud of. Her husband actually went to seminary, and when he graduated, she was given in a ceremony with a with a certificate, and I see somebody nodding. Maybe you know what this is going to be. It was a PhD, not a PhD. And it was a degree, if you will. It was not a real degree, but a degree of putting hubby through. And that was the degree that they gave the women at the time, So it was only after that, and after Title IX started in the 1972, when it was passed, which many people associate first with sports, but that began to open up doors in many different ways and eyes for women to step into different fields, and for the law and for medicine and for theology and the sciences to begin to open up, so that nowadays we actually have more women in law schools than men. Where there are more women undergraduates than there are men. In some fields, there are feature stories in the Washington Post still of the first woman who made certain discoveries even during COVID, or in medicine, and in encouraging women in STEM. But all of that started and expanded widely post the passing of Title IX, and if schools wanted to accept federal monies, then they had to think about equality for women and what did that mean? We're still trying to define that in many, many different ways. So when we begin to think then also of the issues of women, that is when women began to able to articulate more the whole issues of violence against women. And violence against women, as Chris read from the World Health Organization and the UN, takes many different forms. And this is where I think domestic violence is a terrible and a pervasive issue for women. But in definition, it is only one of many different ways that we think of violence against women. Violence can take many forms. It's not just physical. It is emotional. It is psychological. And it can be in many, many different ways. One of the big ways that we hear now, and sometimes people don't think about it as violence, but it is a violence, and that is sexual harassment, or the Me Too, or what we at the Judges Association referred to as sextortion, which was when someone is in a position of power, whether in the home or in the workplace, in the sports arena, in schools, that they can use that power, and it may be without any physical assault, but it is an assault on the mind, on a coercion to get one to either perform an act, to react in certain ways, and talk about that a little bit more later. But I'd like to give you just some other examples of what I have encountered in my work over time, to think about of other examples of violence against women. Some of these exist in the US for sure. Some of them may be more in some other areas, other regions. But human trafficking itself, both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, is a form of violence. And it is a form of violence that can be physical, it can be emotional, it can be psychological, it can be binding. And so trafficking in its different forms, I would say, is a form of violence. One of the things that people are fighting in different places, and we think of it only in other countries, but there was an article again in the Post a week or so ago about the age of marriage and child marriage that still takes place, and whether or not it can be legal. And is it legal if a parent consents to have somebody marry at this age, at 12, 13, 14? It certainly is an issue in other countries. You hear now about the terrible situation of girls in Afghanistan And one of the things that is happening, and it happens there, it happens in other countries, where families become so desperate that they may sell their girl at 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, certainly when she hits puberty at whatever age that is, to somebody who may be 2 or 3 times their age. That's a violent act against that young girl, usually stops her education, usually is very detrimental to her health, and certainly in other ways. Um, of course, sexual assault, but stalking is a form of violence. Even isolation, where someone is forced to isolate and not be able to leave their home, talk with others. That is also a form of violence. There are some traditional um, activities that and things against women that the United Nations, countries have been fighting. And again, it is amongst some immigrant communities in the US still conducted, though not legal. And that is the what is known as FGM, or female genital mutilation, genital cutting of girls, to so that they remain chaste and do not experience sexual pleasure in the same way as they might otherwise. Another form of violence has happened with the whole issue when HIV/AIDS has been so big, though under control in some places. In Africa, it's a very challenging thing for women, because women very often do not have a choice about whether or not they want to have sex, even with their husband, whether or not they can use protection. And literally, if you are in a place where HIV/AIDS is still quite prevalent and people literally are dying, it can be an issue of life and death, and thus again of violent issues. So there are many different ways to think about different kinds of violence against women. I personally had a young woman working with me at the Judges Association, and she really was wanting, she had 4 young children under the ages of 8. She tried very hard to make her marriage work. It was a very challenging situation. She was the wage earner. He was not. He was dependent on her for his immigration status. And if they did split, that would potentially mean he would have to leave the US. There were a lot of different factors in that. And 18 years ago, this month, just a week or so ago, several of us remember the day we were holding a Women's History Month event, and had done that, and we all departed, left to take the metro in Washington to our respective homes. And the next morning, one of the women and I were speaking at an event, and Diana, her name was Diana, was supposed to be there, and she didn't come. We didn't know why. We found out later that when she got home that night in front of her 4 children, her husband literally beat her to death. And it was the 8-year-old who was calling the police. And so the experience of that, she was someone who had tried to work through the court to get counseling, to know what her rights were, all of these things, and probably better than most individuals in terms of what one needs to do to try either to make this marriage work or to look for alternatives if you are in a situation where the woman needs to leave. And yet she still was unable to leave that situation, and it cost her her life. So those are kind of concerning and not very pleasant things to discuss in terms of violence against women. But I think the key thing is that violence used to be a very much a private matter. It used to be even a private matter in law, where women it was just basically what happened in the home was in the home, and it wasn't something people discussed outside the home. It wasn't something that the law dealt with very much. And so what we've seen over time and over the course of certainly my lifetime and my professional lifetime is that violence against women in its different forms is discussed. It is recognized. The first Violence Against Women Act was not passed until 1994 and signed by President Clinton. It has been reauthorized 4 times, again, 2000, 2005, 2013, and 18. But it's not an easy reauthorization every time either. There are parts of it that are challenged or of concern. So, we found, I think we've come quite a long ways in terms of how these issues have become public, how we have discussions like this. We have a Women's History Month, and we talk about it in different places. But we still find things that I think sometimes surprise us. For instance, away from the violence against women, but just in medical studies. For years and years and years, medicine studied heart attacks. And as some of you know, they studied male heart attacks and then applied them to women. But they find that women may have different ways of symptoms that manifest themselves in different ways, but that's not what the medical studies were for years and years and years. There are, again, other things that have happened that have begun to raise these things. And I think we've made so much progress. We can kind of back up to the 70s, when women around the world began to see that the issues they had were issues in common. These were not just US issues or just Indian issues or Chinese issues, but they were very much issues across the board. And it led to a series of world conferences on women, the first one in 1975 in Mexico City, where a number of thousand of women went to Mexico, talked about issues of women, and then 5 years later, there was another World Conference for Women in Copenhagen, in 1985, in Nairobi, and in 1995, the last one was in Beijing, China. I was privileged to go to that and was able to both participate in or observe the government side and participate in the non-government side. And for those of you who may be able to remember, the Chinese and the world were overwhelmed because governments sent their delegations, but there were 30 to 40,000 women who were not government representatives who came from all over the world and descended on China, much to the Chinese chagrin. And they ended up sending the non-government meeting some miles, 20 miles outside of Beijing, emptied a whole town, put all the women there, tried to keep everybody contained there as women talked and talked and talked about the issues that they had. And so this showed that these were not just issues about violence. They were issues about education. They were issues about clean water. They were issues about housing. They were issues about having your own voice. And so out of that, again, I was able to work with the the administration then, I was working at a international foundation, and we held the first post-Beijing conference in the US to talk about what women had demanded. Those women who had been sent out of Beijing and were doing what they demanded the governments do was to be held accountable for what they said they were going to do. And they had what was called a platform for action to say, what are you going to do about violence? Not just talk about, oh, isn't it bad? But what kinds of legislation, what are you going to do about increasing the ability of girls to stay in school, even by a year or two, within a certain period of time? And so that kind of thing has gone on and grown to the point that the UN now has what are called the Sustainable Development Goals. In the year 2000, they had what we refer to as the Millennium Development Goals. For the next 10 years, what could and should governments be doing about these different issues? And especially, again, in our case for women. Now we are in the Sustainable Development Goals, which are between 2020 and 2030. What are governments supposed to be doing? There's 17 Sustainable Development Goals. 2 of them are particularly relevant for us. One is that on gender and gender equality, number 5. And the other one is number 17, which is on peace, on justice, and on better institutions to make peace and justice work. And so those are, you will hear if you work at all internationally and work with non-government organizations, you may hear again the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, and we can talk about those more. What I have seen and experienced myself is just to tell you a little bit about a couple of examples of women judges that I have known and seen what difference they can make on behalf of women in these institutions as we're looking for peace and justice. One is a story that the former Chief Justice of Canada, Beverly McLaughlin, would talk about one of her early cases before she was on the Supreme Court there. But she was holding a court, and she was a judge, which was fairly unusual at the time. But it happened to be that the prosecutor was a judge, and the clerk of the court, was a woman. Sorry, and the prosecutor was a woman. A defense attorney was a woman, and it was a male who was appearing before them. And the male was kind of looking up and down and shuffling his feet and not saying much. And she said to him, she said, "You seem uncomfortable here. What is, everything will be all right. You can speak up. You can say what your concerns are. We will ask you questions." And he still had a problem with that. And she said, "So what is your big concern?" And he says, "I don't think I can get a fair trial." And she said, "Why?" He says, "Because it's only women here." And when she was using the example of how many decades or centuries have women been the only woman in court with all male judges, lawyers, prosecutors, and everything. And it never dawned on in reverse that why could a woman not get a fair trial? And yet this man felt, made that comment. Lady Brenda Hale, who was the first woman on the Supreme Court in the UK, talks about when she first went, she was the first woman. And all of the what was in the House of Lords then, and every member of that court in the House of Lords had been male, so they were Lord. And when they painted her door, they put Lord Brenda Hale, because every judge was a Lord. And she refused to have that on her door. She said, I am not a lord, I am a lady, and I want lady. But it was just, again, the expectation that that wasn't gonna, that wasn't how it would be. One of the people that I think we all need, I hold up in extremely high esteem, is a woman from South Africa named Navi Pillay. And she is of kind of Indian South African background, but South African. And she became a lawyer and a judge. And she then was appointed to the criminal court for Rwanda. And if you remember Rwanda, there was great genocide in Rwanda when there was the civil war there. And they then had a criminal court established. She went on to become on the International Criminal Court and then the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and served that position for a number of years. But when she was on the Rwanda court, it was because she was a woman, many would say, and see that she, for the very first time in centuries, ruled that rape in war was in fact a war crime. It wasn't just something that happened during war. And rape throughout centuries, if you go back, it just pillage and rape. These were the images of what happened in a war, or when one group invaded another. They stole the women, they raped the women. But Navi Pillay was the first one who said, no, it is not just something that happens that we have to put up with. Rape itself can be a war crime. And that is now what is the international understanding of rape in terms of when it happens during war. So I use some of those examples of what difference it can make also when you have, and we have begun to have over the last some decades, more and more women holding positions where there is a different approach and understanding very often. Doesn't mean that they're always going to rule in favor of a woman versus a man. Doesn't mean that it's going to, some people will think it's fair, but the expectation that it opens up a different perspective, I think, is what can make a big difference. And again, as I said, I think it's important to keep in mind that whether international, domestic, local, the issues can be very much the same. Domestic violence can target people of all ages. It can target people of all races, all economic status, all education level, the sexes. It can be perpetrated by the same. It can be perpetrated against men as well as women, although women are the primary victims of domestic violence. But I will just say in here locally, to bring it down local to some examples. The sheriff's office here keeps data on protective and peace orders. Maryland keeps data on these. And I just thought I would share, I'm not a big statistics person. In terms of, I'd rather tell, again, some of these stories. But you may be surprised, and these are orders of protection used primarily to protect against the potential for violence. In 2022, there were 883 orders of protection issued, resulting in 2,093 hearings in Calvert County that included protective, extreme risk, and peace orders. And this is what is going on here. So far this year, there have been 173 orders of protection issued, resulting in 433 hearings in our local court on, again, protective extremists and peace orders. In 2023, there have been 200 so far. Keep in mind, we're not even really 1/4 of the way through the year. There have been 288 domestic calls for service for help, including all kinds of domestic types. So that's just Calvert County, just this year and just last year. So when we think about, what both progress we've made and challenges that we have, these are the kinds of things that are still before us. I'm going on, Chris. I don't know if you want me to stop.
Yeah,
I will give you
yeah,
just a couple of.
we are thrilled to continue hearing this. So I do want to let everyone know we scheduled to end at 8, but we're going to go a little bit over time, because we're eager to hear everything Joan has to share with us. But if you leave at 8, we totally understand.
I just want to I'll give you a couple of short examples of the other area where I personally have done quite a bit of work, and that is on this whole sexual harassment and sextortion. Because these are kinds of things that women, you still hear daily in the newspapers, on the news, about someone who's in a position of power. It can be a policeman stopping at a traffic stop. It can be hate to say, a judge issuing a decision. It can be there are examples after example. An immigration officer who says to a woman who wants to get a green card in order for her to be able to stay and work in the US, well, I will do this if you will do this for me. And that means you have sex, you meet me, you do certain things. There was a high school principal in Montana who threatened a young woman with withholding her graduation diploma in order to hold this power over her. A prosecutor in Wisconsin who had a domestic violence case, and he kept texting her and wanted her to meet him off on the side, not in the office, but on the side, in order to decide whether or not he would really prosecute the domestic violence case, because her partner had tried to choke her. And he was saying, well, maybe I will, maybe I won't. But if you want to meet me, at this coffee shop, well, she actually did, but she recorded him. When it was first taken and challenged, they took it to the bar in order to challenge that this prosecutor should be removed. The bar itself said they didn't really see anything wrong because nothing really happened. Ultimately, when it was made public and the public heard that they weren't going to do anything to this prosecutor, then the bar decides to take it on. But there are these kinds of things. And the city of Baltimore, a few years ago, had a case where there was an $8 million suit that was resolved because there were women in low-income housing who were provided by the housing came through a city program, and the maintenance people and the people who took care of the apartments would not fix the plumbing, fix the light, or do anything like that unless they extorted these women for sex or other things in these housing projects. And the city itself had to resolve this, and the women won this $8 million suit. These kinds of things are not the Hollywood star, who are facing some of this to get the movie that they want. They are, in fact, everyday people who are in positions where they must rely on people who should be in legitimate positions of authority, but who should be making them fairly and squarely based on the facts or what they're supposed to be doing, not using that authority for other means. And that is a form not of violence, it's a form of corruption. And sometimes because it falls through the cracks, it's not prosecuted as either. And it just goes on. So these kinds of things, if you begin to be aware of them, they are in fact in our papers and on the news all the time. The other thing in terms of examples of more local trafficking and labor trafficking. Well, for one, Maryland is number 4 in the country for trafficking cases. And one of the reasons we are is because of our location. And if you think about it, we have interstates going north and south. We have interstates going east and west. We have the water. We have the ports. We have major airports. We have sports arenas. We are the center of people coming for tourism and different things like that. And so we are, in fact, an area that faces lots of trafficking. But there are different other ways that it's not just the sex trafficking. And now that I should say, sports, World Cup, World Series, things like that, they are prime areas where trafficking has to be really closely watched because of bringing all these people in, especially younger men in prime time to bring in young women for a trafficking situation. But there are also labor trafficking cases in this region, in this eastern part of the US, etc. Nail salons, immigrants who are brought in to work in the nail salons, passports taken away. Another area is a hair braiding salon again. There have been cases of day laborers, crab pickers, riverboat casino workers. Even there were cases a few years ago that I was aware of, not right here, but in other places where Eastern European women were brought in and their passports taken away. They were locked in apartments at night, and they were then used as cleaners of stores, grocery stores and others at night, only let out to go work and then come back and locked back in those apartments. That's a different kind of violence than we're talking, but it's still a violence of someone's person. And so there are lots of different ways that we can, I think about these and trying to work through legislation that is the Commission for Women, we are members of something called MLAW, the Maryland Legislative Action for Women, that does kind of monitor and learn about legislative issues facing Maryland. General Assembly right now. Again, looking at the SDGs and other things like that. So in terms of thinking ahead or thinking back, we've made lots and lots of progress there's lots more legislation, lots more social services, lots more people paying attention to these various issues, but we still have quite a ways to go. And so I think I should stop and let you all talk or raise questions and respond.
Thank you so much for sharing, Joan. We really appreciate hearing your perspective and sharing both internationally and domestically. Briefly, I just wanted to see if Mariana is here with us this evening. No? Okay. Okay, then in that case, we will move on. But I do just also want to highlight another organization, the Dream Queen Foundation in Calvert County, who are working with women and girls. And so next, we'll move to our Q&A portion of the evening.
I'm going to jump in. I just want to acknowledge Rachel's shared something in the chat that's very personal and painful, and I want to create space if Rachel wants to say something about that. If she doesn't, that's totally understandable, but since it's it's sharing with some courage, and I don't want that to be overlooked. So I'm Bob Reeg. I'm the CEO of Peace Through Action, and I'm just calling that out. So not to call you out, Rachel, to put you on the spot, but just to make sure that you are feeling included and able to speak on your concern if you wish to. And if not, we'll just carry forward and ask other questions or comments that people want to share.
Thank you.
And while Rachel considers that or not, I have a start question. Rachel, Joan, is there like a network of women's commissions around the country? Is this a pretty typical structure in most counties in America or most cities, or is Calvin's thing in innovative and new thing?
There is, for instance, a Maryland Commission for Women, and I believe there are something like 14 or 15 commissions for women in Maryland. So by county, obviously not every county has a commission for women, but there is a Maryland Commission for Women too. And they do try to both learn and share. There's a kind of a networking, that's an opportunity. There are members that are, the Maryland Commission is made up of members from different counties, though not from Calvert County, has it been for a while, so we need to get somebody on there. But a couple of years ago, the Maryland Commission for Women, for instance, had something they called Voices of Maryland, and they did go around doing basically a listening tour. I'm not sure that they hit every every commission, but they went to a number of them to try to get the voices of women and what women saw as concerns and interests within the state. I do want to say, and if we can, Chris, if this is possible, the Calvert County Commission for Women has just developed a survey, a poll that we want to start introducing and send around to women and men in Calvert County, just to try to get a sense of what concerns there might be, what interests they have. Are there have people, are they aware of the Commission for Women itself, and have they participated in some of our programming? And are there things they think the commission should be doing or addressing, so that we can try to keep that in mind as we move forward too. So it's an online link, about 20 questions. Won't take people long, but we'd love to be able to send the link to you all and through, and would really welcome your input.
Yeah, thank you.
There is a National Commission for Women, and they are around. I honestly don't know the statistics. We are a member of that, but to be honest, but we don't get a whole lot of information from them in terms of really knowing too much about the how many there are around the country.
Yeah, well, we can most definitely amplify that in our newsletter and social media. And that's actually a great segue for us, because we also have an event survey, which I'm including in the chat right now, but that will also be included in correspondence emails to follow up with everybody. But we'll gather some of that similar information that we'd be happy to share. Just putting that out there.
Sandra, I saw you had a question about the status of the commission. Has that been answered?
You're muted.
Yes, she answered that. I just wonder, what can we do?
That's what I was going to ask.
Well, I mean, in my mind, one of the things you're doing right now is just listening, learning, and trying to raise awareness. We would welcome the commission. I didn't really mention October, for instance, is nationally Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We always do a forum. We've had programs where we have an event at the courthouse, and usually have the sheriff's department and the state's attorney, and Safe Harbor, which is the domestic violence shelter. some of the other services in the county to try to raise awareness of those and have the Board of County Commissioners issue a proclamation about, concern about domestic violence. But if there are ways that we can, spread the word more broadly, really, about what does exist. These things happen, just like the trafficking. People don't realize that when I first met Catherine Marsh, who's on our commission, but who used to be a deputy state's attorney, we were having coffee at Panera to meet. And she kept looking at her phone and she apologized and said, "I'm sorry, but we think we found one of the young women from the county, 14-year-old, who had been abducted in a trafficking situation." And they were tracking her. First, they thought in Washington. And then they had missed her by about 15 minutes. And then by the time we finished, she got another buzz on her phone and a picture, and they had just gotten and reached this girl. She was in a hotel in Baltimore. And I didn't see the face, but I saw the picture they took and of her leg. She had a tattoo on her leg. And in fact, that was not a tattoo, it was a branding of this young woman. And this was happening to a young woman who was just here, who got caught up on the computer, in terms of hooking up with somebody who she thought was a nice guy, and then she disappeared. These kinds of things happen. And so, trying to both be aware of April is Sexual Assault Awareness Month. January is Human Trafficking. There's all these different months, but there's so many of them. I think it is, difficult to know exactly what to do. I would mention a number of the Sheriff's Department really, and they work hard in terms of trying to work and understand domestic violence and violence against women and how to deal with them. There is the Crisis Center, the Center for Change, the Child Advocacy Center, the Community Mediation Center, which does get court referrals too in terms of trying to deal with anger management court cases and mediation. We have Safe Harbor, the domestic violence shelter. There at the University of Maryland's one of the few places that started has something called the Safe Center, which tries to deal with helping trafficking victims after they have been essentially gotten out of a trafficking situation. Even Community Resources has a family network in the county, which is again trying to just be aware of various issues of abuse, of violence, of trafficking. I was just talking with somebody connected with that the other day. They're going to be putting up posters of about trafficking because they're concerned. It's not so much some of these places here, but it's girls from here, especially who may be taken elsewhere. But I think a lot of it is just, becoming aware and sharing the word and trying to see, are there places where either that need whether it's volunteers or help or supporting some of the younger women in what programs might exist to try to, it's the vulnerable girls, especially who may have challenges at home or elsewhere, to see what we can do there.
Okay,
I have a question.
Yeah.
Is there legislation that has been introduced or should be, or that would bolster whatever resources are available, particularly in Calvert County, but in the state? Or is funding an issue, or is it training for law enforcement and everybody involved in both the criminal justice system and the domestic violence area? I mean, you can raise awareness, but if you run into some of the issues
Right, right.
were referred to in the chat, or people don't believe you, or you weren't beaten up enough, or
One of the things that I think might be helpful, even now, I did note some legal issues, for instance, in the General Assembly right now. One thing that they have been trying to pass for any number of years, and Maryland is one of the few states that still has not passed this, is that Maryland has been trying to pass a law that would repeal using spousal defense for rape in marriage.
they
And
haven't.
yes, this year it now has passed both chambers, but it still has to go through several more readings. And then it would have to be passed collectively and signed. I'm sure if it gets there, should be signed, the governor would sign it, but we are one of the few states that still allows that there is a defense that if you're a spouse, that it's not rape in marriage. That's one on the books right now. There's another one that has passed both chambers, but still has a way to go. And that is if a minor who has been trafficked is caught committing a crime, like stealing from a John or someone, and is that crime is a direct result of that younger person, that minor being trafficked, that the minor would not necessarily have to be criminally prosecuted, but would be provided what they call safe harbor, meaning that if a young person commits a crime partially because of their trafficking situation,
Right.
or they're told while you're there, steal that wallet before you leave the room, that the minor should not be criminally prosecuted. And that again is right now has passed both chambers, but it has quite a ways to go, whether it would get through before the end of the session. There are a number of different things. I should mention, and it would be worth looking up two things. There is a Maryland Network Against Domestic Violence. They have a website. They keep statistics. They have all kinds of resources there. And they did a survey. This is a couple years old now, but in one day in 2019, September 12th, 2019, there were 702 victims of domestic violence were served in one way or another in Maryland that one day.
Well,
but
I guess the issue is really more of trying to prevent it in the first place. And that is right in line with peace through action.
Exactly. The other one I did want to just mention is MLAW, this Maryland Legislative Action for Women, because it is a place, especially right now, these few months, where they are monitoring legislation. And you can join it as an individual, you can just monitor their website and see things, but every November, and again, the Commission for Women as a commission is a member of MLAW. They have an annual meeting in November where they select about 15 or so bills that have been proposed. And up to be a bill that has been proposed, it has to have support from a senator or a member of the House of Delegates, at least one or more. Those people usually come too, and they introduce these various ones that particularly affect women in one way or another. And they may not be just violence; they may be economic. They may be different areas of concern. And And then they send that around to members, and the Commission for Women also looks at them, and we can send in a list of what we see as priorities, rank these 15, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then MLAW will select about 8 of them every year prior to January when the legislature begins. And they will use those 8 as the priorities that they will try to lobby on and push through and encourage for passage in Maryland that particular year. So it's a great way to find what is current really within our own state and try to get involved in that way if you are interested also in legislation. And that is something that your Peace Through Action could also, for instance, identify, are there some that particularly you would also like to just be in touch with our local delegates and our local senators and see where they are on these issues.
Before we
John,
close,
this is Patty. I'm
I
I'm sorry, I can't. I'm not on. I can't get my Wi-Fi to work. I also wanted to add to that the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault, which celebrates, well, or acknowledges sexual assault in the county as well as the state, to around sexual assault issues. And the other thing I was going to ask is there long ago in ancient times of our beginnings in the county, we had a large core, an average of about 20 to 25 women who were trained and were made themselves available after hours, particularly if there were calls for people needing to go to make a claim against a partner to the court commissioner. I was wondering if that is still in existence. I think not. But
there are some court advocates that do that. I will say that there has been, I know, Pat, you were very involved, with the shelter and domestic violence. There has been a change of the crisis center is now called the Center for Change. It is under the health department as the crisis center was before. Their focus, their emphasis has been somewhat more on the concern about mental health and behavioral health and the whole drug issue than as much as it has been the crisis center in the past. But I think, there's definition going on with how the new arrangement is going to be working. I do not believe there's an active, well, there are the court advocates and but not as big, as strong as it had been in the county in the past. There's more a regional effort right now, is my understanding.
there's just one other thing is that the program as it existed back in the early 2000s, as well as from, I guess, 1980 on, was the ability, we were able to get a grant, and Catherine Marsh was hired on the basis of that grant and went and worked into the state's attorney's office, and she made a name for our county and herself, and is currently doing the same work for the United States Army.
Right. And she is an active member of the commission too. So she is a real resource for the county in many different ways. but as I say, there was some transition going on in terms of the crisis center and some of the services. And there is an effort to kind of pull together a Southern Maryland regional effort on advocacy, et cetera, that I think, is still underway. Jennifer Moreland, Director of the Community Resources, and a couple of us have explored some options and even visited a couple other places where there are different approaches to how we might be able to kind of re-energize some of that.
Okay, great. Do we have any additional last questions here? 'Cause we're about to close out. No. Okay, I
It was
do
really
wanna-
interesting. Thank you, Joan.
Oh, you're welcome.
Yes, thank you, Joan.
Yeah, John, you're like awesome. I about you, but now I'm like, wow, this historical perspective, and Calvert County is so blessed to have your talent there indigenously to the county while you have all this other life experience to share with your county and nationally. So you've given a lot of kernels for the Calvert Peace Project to follow up with, both in terms of sharing out some information to others who follow us. Certainly we'll share the survey for the commission on your, get that out. And you've sent us many possibilities that Chris and Mary, our peace agent in the county, and I will puzzle through together to see how to make best use of bounty and knowledge you shared.
Well, I will be happy to keep in touch and follow what you're doing, and the commission is more than willing to partner in different ways. So keep us informed.
Excellent.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joan. We really treasure your insight and experience and everything you had to share with us this evening.
And thanks for putting this together, Chris and Bob. It's really worthwhile. Very excellent.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So here's some ways to engage with us, which we can go more into in the future. But also just want to let you know about a Peaceful Leaders Summer Experience that we'll be holding this summer in July. We're really excited to continue our work with youth. We're engaged in 2 high schools right now. There are 2 high school aged programs. And this summer we'll be doing a deep dive into all things peace building. So we're really excited.
And I hope it includes domestic and sexual violence somehow.
Yes. Yes, after this
Get these
experience.
kids
certain it will be included.
educated while they're young.
Yes. Yeah, and yeah, here's our contact information as well. If you want to reach out or have any thoughts or ideas about collaborations, we're really eager to continue our relationships with everyone present and in the county. So thank you so much for attending our event this evening, and we look forward to seeing you throughout our robust schedule of activities, events, and programs in 2023. So
Great.
Thank you so much, everybody, and especially thank you so much, Joan Winship, for joining us this evening.
Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Bye-bye.
All right, have a
Good
great
night.
night,
Thank you.
everyone.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.